Good afternoon and welcome to LBMA webinars. Today we welcome the LBMA's Responsible Sourcing team as they outline LBMA's strategy for the future of responsible sourcing. Also contributing to this week's webinar is Dr. Mark Pieth, Professor of Criminal Law and Criminology at the University of Basel. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, please use the question and answer function and our panelists will try to answer your questions at the end should there be time. Please note that you will not be able to use the chat function in this webinar. So for now, I'm delighted to hand over to Dr. Mark Pieth as he provides his remarks and reactions to the report. Dr. Pieth is a keen advocate for increased transparency and greater responsibility for key players in the gold sector. So Mark, we really look forward to hearing your views on whether you believe our report has taken that crucial first step towards meeting these expectations. So whenever you're ready, please.
Thank you, Taylor. Well, thanks to the LBMA for inviting me to this launch of the first annual Responsible Sourcing report. I think I would like to start off by congratulating LBMA to this essential step towards more transparency. I think to all of us, it's very clear that we need to know where gold, silver, and other bullion are sourced from and where they go. Now, obviously, this report, as I understand, as an outsider, is a first step. And I think it serves two purposes. It serves the purpose, first of all, to convince the constituency of LBMA that transparency doesn't hurt. It's not harmful, it's useful. And it's actually going to be a process. This is the first step. It also serves the purpose to convince the wider public that the industry can deliver. While it is a first step, it has pros and cons. It has matters that it does provide, and it has shortcomings. Just to share that with you, my first reaction was when I looked at the annexes, I liked very much the quite granular country by country breakdown on countries of origin. That was really, I think it's really interesting. And frankly, as a Swiss observer, I had to chuckle a bit to see what digression there was between your figures and the official Swiss figures. I'll leave it at that. Now, coming to the points where I think you could do more, what I call shortcomings, I have 2 points. One is, I think the amalgamation of destinations is still much too large and broad sweeping. I mean, you have Europe and Africa together, you have the Americas, you have Asia and Australia. I understand what you are, why you're doing that, because you're still a bit cautious about trade secrets and so on, but I think that's a point where your constituency has to learn. The other point where, let's say critical observers are still hoping for more is we don't, of course, know the real source. You wouldn't know that in your files. We don't know, are we talking about legal, informal, or illegal source? Are we talking, for instance, just to give an example, of collectors of gold from Madre de Dios in Peru? That's not something that you would find with this methodology. What we do have to be convinced by LBMA, I think, is that your refineries, that they actually do know. And I think that's what the wider public is interested in. And so I think overall, what you're presenting here is a very good first start. Obviously, there is room for amelioration over the next few years, and I'm happy to see them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as it is with any journey, the first step is always the hardest. We've done a lot of transparency work in the last few years at LBMA. In particular, I think a big one for the team was starting to report the figures in terms of how much gold are in the London vaults. It was a big intake of breath when that first went out, and I think the same with this report. But once you start to have transparency, we start to get the feedback as to what would stakeholders ideally like to see, and have a more informed conversation about what is and isn't possible, as well as some of the limitations of LBMA's reach. And that's something we look to address in the report. So in terms of going back to your specific recommendations on the amalgamation, I'm delighted my colleagues are here. Neil Harvey's going to talk about the country of origin data, what we've got there. But I think it was crucial to get that out, and also to get that specific feedback in terms of wanting to see more. Now, we've put the logic in the report about the same thing we do with trade reporting in terms of having to have at least 3 entities or refiners in a country to disclose that specific country. But part of this work generally for us, and we'll talk about this in the strategy, is about enhanced disclosure. The other aspect in terms of the strategy is the audit itself, and making sure that that is certainly giving us confidence as LBMA, the ones receiving it, that it is a strong, robust, and thorough process, but also to outside stakeholders. Now, I don't want to take too much away because the team has a lot to bring to you today, but I want to say I'm delighted to be joined by Sakila Mirza, our Executive Board Director, who's going to take you through the report itself and what it covers. Susanna McLaren, who will cover the auditors as well as refiners' performance in 2019. Neil, who will also cover our country of origin, as I recommended. And then we'll go back to the future. And really the point is here to get some time for that engagement. We want to hear from you. We have some time to talk about that today, but let's continue the conversation afterwards. I think with that, Sakila, I will hand it over to you to take us through the report itself.
Thank you, Ruth. So for those who haven't read this 38-page report, go ahead and please read it. It is quite comprehensive, and there is a lot of detail. The intention here is this report will be published every year. It probably won't be 38 pages every year. Because it is the first report, our focus has also been in providing some background to the actual responsible sourcing program. What is it? Who's responsible for it? The governance, the enforcement, the limitations, and what does the future look like? So there's a lot of background information in this report, and therefore that's why it's quite long this year. But there's also a huge emphasis, and something that we'll be focusing on every year is the refiner's performance for the previous year. So in this case, in 2020, we're looking at the 2019 performance. Equally, we'll be reviewing the performance of the auditors, again for 2019. And then also providing information on the country of origin. This will be the data that is collected in 2019 for 2018. So in 2021, next year, we will be sharing data for 2019. And also the report covers the future development and the strategy going forward. As we've already highlighted, this is a first step in terms of improving and enhancing the disclosure. We've put this out for feedback. Love to get more in terms of what you would like to see in future reports, but it's not the only work stream when it comes to enhancing transparency. There is a separate work stream where we're looking at guidance for refiners on their disclosure and what their reporting should ideally be reflecting when they put out reports publicly as well. For those who are perhaps new to what the LBMA Responsible Sourcing Programme is about, this requires an annual audit covering 12 months production. It is based on the OECD due diligence framework, and it also applies to all LBMA good delivery list refiners. As I said, it covers all feedstock, so that is LSM, ASM, and recycled. The program is absolutely integral to not just globally, but also the local London market. As Ruth mentioned in her opening, that we also publish data on how much gold is sitting in the vaults, and the gold that is sourced from good delivery list refiners. Today, that number stands at 555 billion US dollars. So it goes to, again, emphasize the importance not just of the local London market, but how important the responsible sourcing program is in providing that integrity and confidence within the marketplace. Now, the program, to be effective, requires a robust governance enforcement process. One of the main unique characteristics of the LBMA program is that it can be enforced. This is because if a good delivery list refiner does not comply with the requirements, the LBMA has powers to remove that refiner from the list. And if it's removed from the list, then the local London market would not accept gold produced by that refiner. And not just local London, a lot of other international governments, they rely on the good delivery list. And if you're not on the list, they would not be accepting gold that comes from that refiner. So that's the enforcement. That actually provides us with the powers to actually make sure that the requirements and that the refiners are complying with the program. We also have what we call the instant review process that looks to review any incidents where there has been market intelligence shared with the LBMA outside of the annual audit to understand how credible is that information, is there evidence to support that information, and then to take the necessary actions to take further the de-escalation. We have a compliance panel that facilitates a lot of the review process and also supported by the physical committee, which is made up of members of the LBMA, namely the banks. However, one point to emphasize here that the final decision to remove a refiner, and given the huge commercial impact it has, the decision lies with the independent NEDs of the LBMA board, as well as the executive board directors. It is a decision that is not taken lightly, and it is taken after going through a huge, robust process to make sure that the facts, the evidence, the information we have gives the NEDs and the executive board members the right amount of information to make that final decision. So that's a little bit about the program, the report, and the enforcement and governance. I'd like to hand over to Susanna, who will take us through a little bit more in terms of the performance, not just for the refiners, but also the auditors last year. Thanks, Susanna.
Thank you, Sakila. So 2019 was the first year for all refiners to implement the changes that were introduced in version 8 of the Responsible Gold Guidance. And version 8 expanded the definition of due diligence by requiring refiners to not only assess OECD Annex 2 risks, but also to include an assessment of ESG responsibilities. And we'll be discussing the findings of the current round of gold audits, which reflect implementation of ESG in our next annual report. 2019 also saw the first round of responsible silver audits. As expected, some refiners had a steeper learning curve than others, in particular those that do not also refine gold. But the overwhelming majority of refiners embraced this work as an important part of being an internationally accredited refiner. Onto the auditor program. So only auditors on LBMA's approved auditors list can be engaged by refiners for their responsible sourcing audit. And the list is managed by LBMA to ensure that auditors meet the stringent standards we expect. Indeed, we acknowledge that LBMA's responsible sourcing program is only as good as the audit process and the auditors themselves. Ongoing review and enforcement of approved auditor requirements are important elements for the credibility of the program. We engage with auditors on our list through training sessions and webinars, but most importantly, through robust audit quality control. We undertake an annual review of each auditor where we look to make sure they remain independent and have appropriate capacity, as well as robust quality assurance procedures. And following an extensive 2019 end-of-year review, this year we limited the geographic remit and scope of engagement for auditors on our list. These measures provide an additional control to ensure that the most appropriate auditor is appointed to suit a refiner's business model. Additionally, the 2019 review resulted in the removal of 5 audit entities and 1 approved lead auditor to ensure the list can continue to be relied upon to provide confidence to the market in 2020 and beyond. And you can view the updated auditors list for 2020 on our website. Moving on to a bit more detail around refiner performance. The report also provides data of non-conformances raised for gold and silver by risk level. And for those of you who may not be aware, LBMA has been reporting this data since 2015 in our annual reports. However, this year we went a step further through the publication of this standalone responsible sourcing report. And we provided a breakdown of the most common types of non-conformances raised against the 5 steps of the responsible sourcing guidance. And if you haven't seen it already, there's a really nifty little graphic that shows that quite nicely, and also talks about the common themes. We're also very pleased to note that no zero tolerances were reported in 2019. And as a reminder, that would be when a refiner would risk losing its accreditation to the good delivery list. However, any non-conformance is taken seriously regardless of the level. And 2019 did, however, see an increase in medium and high risk non-conformances, which were escalated to the compliance panel. The 2 high risk non-conformances for gold in particular related to one refiner in Europe. The report includes more detail about this, but for now I'd like to turn my attention to the case studies by giving a brief overview of 3 of the 5 that we feature in the report. So 2 of the case studies here relate to special audits with a very specific focus, and the other relates to one of the 2 incident review processes we ran in 2019. So Istanbul Gold Refinery and Nadir were 2 special audits triggered by an anonymous grievance from a whistleblower and media allegations that Venezuelan gold was exported to Turkey for refining to help bypass the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela. LBMA requested that both Turkish good delivery refiners perform a limited scope audit to refute any link. The independent audits, which were each conducted by different auditors on our list to the ones originally engaged by those refiners, confirmed that both refiners had not sourced or traded with any entities dealing with Venezuelan gold. And both special audit reports are available on our website. Valcambi was a special audit arising out of a country of origin query reported in the refiner's 2018 data relating to a significant increase in recycled gold from the UAE by the refiner, which LBMA classes as a high-risk jurisdiction. The special audit focused on the refiner's transactions of material received from the UAE in 2018. It was performed by a different auditor selected by the LBMA from our list, and as with the original 2018 audit, found the refiner to be compliant. LBMA subsequently issued the 2018 gold certificate, and again, that special audit is also available on our website. Finally, on to the 3rd case study. An incident review process was invoked by LBMA for MMTC PAMP in summer 2019 in response to human rights and environmental allegations relating to the North Mara gold mine in Tanzania. As part of this review, we spoke to a number of stakeholders and engaged in constructive dialogue with the refiner throughout the process. LBMA concluded that the due diligence undertaken by the refiner was reasonable, and that the independent assessment of the North Mara mine was an appropriate mitigation measure put in place by the refiner to allow for the 2018 Responsible Gold Certificate to be issued. In relation to the last 2 case studies I discussed, we are addressing the media coverage this year through the refiner's annual audit review. Finally, I think it's important to say that we were encouraged that all refiners listed here were fully supportive of LBMA's efforts at improving transparency of the programme and endorsed the inclusion of their case studies in the report. And now I'd like to hand over to Neil to talk more about the country of origin data, which I know is of great interest to many of you. Over to you, Neil.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. Yes, improving transparency, increased transparency. Can I say up front, it's been a privilege to work with the data, to be trusted with the data, and it really is a very interesting data set. There's a lot of information, and there was a lot of challenges in putting the data together, from inconsistent use of units and people not using the metric system, for example. So we have put the data together, we have got it out there. If there are some issues with the data, if you can spot anything with the data that you're not sure about, speak to us, and we can look at the data to make sure that it's as accurate as it can be and as useful as it can be. And also, this is the first year. Next year we'll have the data again, and we can start to look at trends. But a couple of interesting points, and this was a last-minute number that we put together. Of the data provided, 55% is recycled, 44% is from large-scale mines. But the glaring thing, and carrying on from our conversations in Shenzhen and what we've had about ASM, is so very little ASM material goes through the good delivery list refiners. I do accept Mark's, shall we say, advice on how to make things better. But at the moment, again, it's the first step. It's getting the information out there. We are being trusted with the information. So we've come up with a solution. A lot of thought went into these groupings. And yes, it does seem a bit odd to group Africa with Europe, but having only one refinery in Africa, it makes it very difficult. But it's an attempt. And obviously, in the future, there are ways we can rejig the data according to the appetite for how much we can share and how much the refiners are prepared to share, because it is their data and they're entrusting it with us. Just a note on how we've checked the accuracy of the numbers. Obviously, the output of the refineries is well known, so a refinery can't bring in more material. Sorry, can't take out more material than it brought in. That's alchemy, and our refineries are not involved in that business. The other thing is also to speak to people in the market, look at customs data. And again, I want to talk about the Swiss Swan example just now. But yeah, we've made the data as accurate as we can make it, but we know there are room for improvements going forward. And there are a number of ways of which you can present the data, and we've had a lot of fun. I felt like a marketing person coming up with nice diagrams, and that's what you see here. But as a scientist, I think we actually need to look at the data itself. And just to highlight a particular example here is the amount of material that left the United Kingdom and was refined in Switzerland surprised a number of people who don't understand our industry. And what this data provides is information that people can look at and say, oh, I didn't know about this, and question us about it. But it really enhances the transparency initiatives of the LBMA. And I'm really proud of getting the data set out. And I hope you enjoy looking at it. But please, if you have any questions about it, you know where we are, happy to enter into a dialogue. With that, I would like to hand back to Sakila, or Sakila can tell you about the future.
Thank you, Neil. So yes, there's been quite a lot of emphasis on what was 2019 in terms of refiners' performance and the country of origin data. But what are we doing next? There's still lots to be done. I mean, the program was launched back in 2012, so it is 8 years on. And whilst there has been significant amount of development, it doesn't mean that we've stopped. So for the next 3 years, we've identified 5 priorities. And I say we've identified these 5 priorities. If you have any comments on this and you think there's something missing or that we need to add another priority to this list, please do get in touch because we want to make sure we are getting this right. So just to quickly run through, and there's more information in the report, we are going to be focusing more on transparency, improving disclosure, and this is part of our efforts to improve disclosure. Looking at advancing standards and defining best practice, looking at how further to improve our responsible sourcing guidance, both for gold and silver. The audit program, improving the audit program. I think we all know and accept that the audit is only as good as the auditor. What understanding do the auditors have? What is the training, the engagement? So focusing on that over the next 3 years. And we've already sort of focused, and we introduced this back in Shenzhen in October at the annual conference, the call for action when it comes to ASM and high-risk areas. How do we engage responsibly and provide a safe platform for that engagement to be meaningful? And then finally, looking at the value chain accountability, building leverage. I said this right at the beginning, the LBMA cannot do this alone. So understanding where can we actually work with other organizations, other players, other stakeholders to actually affect positive change. So those are the priorities. And then it's focusing on, the report also focuses on what is the ecosystem when it comes to responsible sourcing. The industry programs, they do go quite far. As I said, with the LBMA, it is quite unique in the fact, in how it enforces the program. The ultimate sanction being you will be removed from the good delivery list. But like I said, there's still limitations. So there are actions that, and steps that national authorities can take to further complement the efforts being taken by the industry. There are downstream actors who also need to be engaged and work together, and as well as other stakeholders who do have valuable information. How can we use that information? How can we collaborate to make sure that we're affecting positive change collectively? Each group brings huge amounts of benefit, but we also understand each group does have those limitations. Hence, this has to be a collaborative effort. So with that, we are looking at working with stakeholders, in particular the national authorities and civil society, in coming up with recommendations for international Bullion Centres. These are international Bullion Centres that the LBMA is going to predefine. And the focus will be for to work together to come up with recommendations that the international Bullion Centres need to adopt and support. The main focus of these recommendations will be on recycled gold. We all recognize the challenges with recycled gold, but we also understand the benefits. I mean, there have been some downstream actors who have only committed to sourcing recycled gold as part of their supply chain. We want to be able to work together to address those challenges that recycled gold does bring, and see what the national authorities, civil society, and other industry bodies can do to support that effort. Eliminating cash transactions. Again, this is something, whilst I sort of say it very broadly, eliminating cash transactions, it's not possible in every scenario, and this is in relation to ASM. So we understand for ASM, we may need to sort of still have that in place, but otherwise, working together to eliminate cash transactions is another priority we've identified for Bullion Centres. And then finally, supporting responsible ASM. So we're calling on the authorities to support the recommendations, help us finalize these, and then to adopt within a reasonable time frame. So with that, we do welcome feedback on what we've just highlighted. And like I said, there's more detail in the actual report, which looks at each recommendation in a little bit more detail. And we will be publishing more information on this in the next few weeks. We would also welcome feedback on the 3-year strategic plan. And as I said, in terms of making sure that we've got those priorities right. And then when we look to implement those priorities, making sure that we're implementing them appropriately. So that concludes the presentation. We would like to open it up to questions. So over to Ruth for any Q&A.
Thank you, Sakila. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Susanna. I wanted to bring the panel up and to open up to some of these questions in Q&A. One thing I wanted to throw over to Neil was, we put these percentages up for types of material going through the list. And I think that got the big headline with the amount of LSM, for example. But, I think we talk about a call for action for ASM, but I think that 1% number really speaks for itself. What do you think really needs to change? I mean, I'm just thinking of your experience as working at a former refinery. Mm-hmm. I think that there's goodwill, but that's not being translated into the numbers. What can we do to address it?
Yeah, you're right. I agree with you. This carries on with what we presented in Shenzhen. The amount of ASM material going through GDL refineries is very low. And when you speak to the refineries who are doing it, and then speak to the refineries who aren't doing it, there's a number of common themes that keep coming up as to why it's too risky, or the risk benefit it doesn't make sense. But through this process, we're getting a better understanding of what those challenges are, what those risks are. And I think one of the things the LBMA can do is to make sure that the story is being told, the information is being shared, so that refineries who come up with issues can share what those issues are, so that as an industry we can address those issues, and we can speak about them. We can speak about them in these forums, and we can speak about them in other forums, to make sure that the information is being shared between the people who need to know it.
And, I think one of the questions that just come up too, in terms of like, we're asking for support, what are we specifically going to do about it? And I know, as the person who's responsible for being on all of these groups to lend your expertise, I mean, I don't know if you want to share a little bit about the forums we're currently we're engaged in.
Yeah, I mean, going back through period, and I'm aware that some of my fellow colleagues who have also been involved in these programs, is things like development of the craft code through the Alliance for Responsible Mining. I think that's an excellent program, that if you want to engage with ASM as a refinery, the tools are there, the information is there. So the craft code is something that I highly recommend. But also things like the Swiss Better Gold initiative. There are governments involved, there are NGOs involved that are doing really good work out there. Impact is another example, and it's really that they want to speak, they want to tell their story, and I think it's up to us to make sure that story gets heard.
Yeah, and I think, LBMA, one thing we really tried to get through, and Sakila talked about this, in terms of we have a particular stick that we are committed to using in terms of this commercial necessity for a refiner to be on our list, which means we can set a high standard and we can enforce it. One thing that we commonly get questions, have you ever removed refiners? We've actually removed 5. And I think for Dr. Pieth's perspective, one of those included a Swiss refiner as well. So we've removed them for responsible sourcing reasons, and we remain committed to do that as it is necessary. But I think Sakila also outlined, it is a big step. It is something that we do thoughtfully.
Ruth, if I could just add,
please.
one of the probably the most important lessons we've learned is that if something does go wrong, it's how we respond to that is more important. So that we don't encourage disengagement if it's easy to disengage. What we encourage is, if something has gone wrong, what do you do to fix it? Can it be fixed? If it can't be fixed, obviously, if there's zero tolerance non-conformance like child labour or things like that, obviously we use the stick. But if something's gone wrong and somebody is genuinely making an effort to try and do the right thing, we should be supporting them in that. And when things do go wrong, how do we fix it and make sure that it can carry on?
And I think that's, part of the objective today is about how do you act in good faith and how do you demonstrate people are acting in good faith. And I think we have taken a step as LBMA to do the disclosure, but I think we've also made it clear to refiners it's their turn next, that there needs to be more information coming out. Some of the other questions we're getting is about real-time reporting and disclosure. And Sakila, I'm going to ask you a little bit more about this, because partly the plan was certainly to commit to an annual reporting on the program, and that is also giving clarity on that annual stream of work that's happening. But do you want to talk a little bit more about the disclosure side for both refiners as well? And Mark, I would say if you have something else you'd like to join to add in, I'll open it over to you as well. So.
Sure. Thanks, Ruth. And I've also seen there's been a few questions around the LBMA's incident review process, and in terms of providing more transparency and more reporting around the actual review process itself. So the review, let me just talk a little bit about this. The review process, it is confidential insofar as we could be getting sensitive information that we need to make sure we are treating sensitively. We want to make sure we have the right information, because there's a lot of information that the LBMA gets. There's a lot of speculation, there's a lot of statements. At times there is evidence to support a lot of that. So we have to make sure we can verify the information we're getting, the statements that people are providing, the information that they're sharing. We don't want to discourage that, because again, we're part of this ecosystem that we've got a role to play, but so has everybody else. What we have to make sure is, if we are going to take the step of either suspending a refiner or removing a refiner, that it is the right step and it will give you the right outcome in terms of the engagement. Removing a refiner does have serious implications, not just for the refiner, but for the industry as well. So that decision has to be taken, and it has to be taken with the evidence and with the right information. And whilst we're going through that process, sharing that information through the process can be disruptive to the review process itself. So I know there's a lot of information for real time, like to know where we are in those processes, like to have more information. The only danger with that it could be more disruptive than it can be helpful. That is not to stop people from sharing information. That is just to say that we have to be very sensible and sensitive to what's being shared. In terms of refiners' disclosure, this is where the refiners do need to be more proactive in highlighting any grievances, any challenges, any issues that they've had, so they can get ahead of some of this, the challenges and the issues that we face by publicly disclosing it and actually committing to what it is that they're doing to mitigate some of this. This is what we're working on, and there will be more information later this year in terms of this disclosure project that the refiners should be looking to comply with.
Okay, thanks, Akila. Mark, you've taken yourself off mute, so please.
Yeah, thank you. I've had this question about what did I really mean by saying we need to know? And actually, I've been asking for trouble because it's, in my view, it's a staged process. There are at least 4 stages. First of all, of course, refineries, under the rules of the OECD, they need to know pretty well where they're sourcing their gold from. That's really the first stop. Now, auditors need to be convinced, and that's what Susanna has been talking about, and they need to do a good job, that they need to be convinced that the refineries are really up to it, that their methodology is right. LBMA then, of course, is further removed from this whole process, but needs to be sure that the system as such is working and that your auditors are up to their job. Finally, there is, I see, a 4th layer, and that's where I place myself in, but many other people who are asking questions at the moment, the wider public. We need to be convinced by LBMA and others that the whole thing is working. That's what I think, what I understand by we.
Thank you, Mark. No, I think the wider public and the consumer as well, because ultimately, London, we look after a wholesale market, but that eventually goes to the consumer in terms of product. So there is certainly, from when we started this program in 2012, the understanding that the consumer needs to know more and more, partly because they've become involved through the ETF side of things. But also, I think that's just the train of, or the direction of travel when wanting more transparency and more information. And also, we have tried to lead by example with this report in saying, not just everything's perfect. We've seen like, this is where we've seen challenges and how we look to address. And I think your point about the auditor, that has to be something that we, in your sense, have confidence in. And when we first started this journey in 2012, it's certainly something we perhaps underestimated in terms of how much work is involved in training the auditors. But that's certainly a principal part of where we go from now, is making sure that is something that we can trust in. So I think with the slide coming back on, that is my reminder that we are well over time. And I encourage you, I've seen a lot of questions come through that we haven't necessarily gotten to go back to. We'll come back to you directly. And I'd also then encourage you to have a look at our upcoming webinars. We have every Thursday, and I think next week is Digital Gold. Taylor?
Yeah, so we're starting our digital series, a new series on digital gold. So this will be part 1 of what we hope to be a few more. We will be welcoming CoinShares and their executive chairman, and we'll be welcoming Sprott and their CEO to open the discussion. So we hope that you could join us for that if that's your area. And then on the 15th, we have a special webinar titled Dragon in the Room. So we have James King from the Financial Times. This will be a special 1-hour webinar, which will not be available post broadcast. So we really hope that you can join us for that. So this will be kind of a feature on what's going on in China, and will be a special webinar featuring obviously kind of to coincide with what would have been our conference. And I've written TBC next to what's on the 22nd because we are still fine-tuning that particular webinar. We've got a few people, a few themes that we're just fine-tuning at the moment. So those are the 3 upcoming webinars for October. And I think, if there's anything else that anyone would like to add, if not, I might just wrap up today's webinar. Anybody else? No. So thank you all for joining. So thank you, Neil, Sakila, Susanna and Ruth, and thank you, Mark, again for joining us. It is always a pleasure to have you on, and we've come quite a way since we first had you on back in April. But as always, it's a pleasure to have you on, and we thank all of our guests, our attendees, for joining us, and this recording will be available this afternoon. So thank you, and goodbye.